WHO committee said they're fairly confident that Ebola hasn't spilled out of the most affected countries into the neighboring states of Mali, Guinea-Bissau, or Côte d'Ivoire. Jason Beaubien, NPR News.
Wall Street powered to life today with some major gains, fueled by some strong third-quarter corporate earnings reports from General Motors and American Airlines, among others. The Dow, just before the close, was up 217 points. That's 1.33%. The Nasdaq was up 70 points. This is NPR. School officials in Colorado say 3 high school students who reportedly tried to join the self-described Islamic State had no prior disciplinary problems. They say they believe the girls were lured into leaving the U.S. by someone they met online. Authorities stopped them at the Frankfurt airport and they're back with their families. Officials at the Justice Department are condemning leaks from Ferguson, Missouri, connected to the police shooting of 18-year-old African-American Michael Brown. St. Louis Public Radio's Stephanie Lecce reports federal officials call the leaks irresponsible and highly troubling.
A Justice Department spokesperson says there seems to be an inappropriate effort to influence public opinion as a grand jury considers whether to indict Ferguson officer Darren Wilson for fatally shooting Michael Brown. Earlier this week, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch reported on a leaked copy of the official St. Louis County autopsy of Brown, which suggested he was shot at least once at close range. The Justice Department calls the leaks a selective release of information and says it's conducting its own investigations into the case and into the Ferguson Police Department. An attorney for Brown's family says they are not surprised by the leaks, but he says the information does not explain why Wilson shot Brown several times when he was more than 20 feet away from Wilson's patrol car. For NPR News, I'm Stephanie Lecce in St. Louis.
The man who jumped over the White House fence last night has been charged with 3 felony counts and 4 misdemeanors. The Secret Service says canine dogs stopped Dominic Adesanya on the White House lawn. The Secret Service says Adesanya is from Bel Air, Maryland, and he was unarmed. I'm Barbara Klein, NPR News in Washington.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include the George Gund Foundation, working to advance Cleveland and Northeast Ohio at gundfoundation.org.
At 3:06 in New Orleans, 73 degrees with winds out of the north at 10 miles per hour. A mostly clear night is ahead with a low in the upper 50s, and a sunny Friday is ahead with highs in the mid-70s. Support for the station comes from the law firm of Sullivan Stoliar, the Health Law Center, formed in 1987 to serve the business, payment, and regulatory compliance needs of healthcare providers. Sullivan Stoliar means health law. They're on the web at thehealthlawcenter.com.
From NPR News, this is All Things Considered. I'm Robert Siegel.
And I'm Audie Cornish. An emotional day in the Canadian capital, Ottawa. Members of Parliament sang the national anthem as they opened their session, the day after a gunman killed an honor guard at a National War Memorial and then stormed the Parliament building. In a moment, we'll examine what yesterday's events may reveal about the way Canada approaches potential terrorist threats. NPR's Jackie Northam begins our coverage in Ottawa.
Parliament's return to business 24 hours after the deadly attacks here in Ottawa set the tone. Life must go on. Members of Parliament gave a hearty standing ovation for Kevin Vickers, the sergeant-in-arms who killed the attacker just a few feet shy of the lawmakers' caucus room. That was followed by a moment of silence for Corporal Nathan Cirillo, who was shot dead by 32-year-old Michael Zahaf-Bibeau as he stood guard over the nearby National War Memorial. Prime Minister Stephen Harper made it clear the country would not bow to violence.
We will be vigilant, but we will not run scared. We will be prudent, but we will not panic. And as for the business of government, well, here we are in our seats, in our chamber, in the very heart of our democracy, and our work goes on.
Outside Parliament, many of the surrounding streets are still closed off, and police are everywhere. The hordes of reporters that have descended on Ottawa mill about, while cameras cameramen filmed the picturesque House of Commons and the War Memorial. Richard Beard, a young engineering student at the University of Ottawa, said he'd come to the War Memorial to pay his respects.
I'm not here for anything else but the soldier. I'm actually checking to see if I know that now you can bring flowers, so I think I'm going to come back with some. But, that's the reason why I'm here.
Beard says the whole thing feels surreal, that it's hard to believe this could happen in Ottawa. This city has an open feel to it, especially around Parliament, where its broad lawns are regularly used for games of soccer or frisbee. There have been only 5 murders in Ottawa this year. But many people interviewed say they're not naive and know that Canada isn't immune from attacks, especially now since the government has signed on to a U.S.-led effort against the so-called Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Janaki Modi, owner of the nearby Parliament pub, says it's clear security is going to be more of an issue now.
And with us, sending troops over and getting in the fight and speaking our minds, we're definitely on the target list, obviously.
Still, Modi says once the shock of the violence has passed, the community will only be stronger. Jackie Northam, NPR News, Ottawa.
This week's killings of Canadian soldiers, one run over by a car on Monday, one shot to death yesterday, brought to mind allegations of planned terror attacks in 2 other countries. Last month, Australian police charged a man they linked to ISIS with conspiring to commit demonstration killings in Australia. News reports there claimed the conspirators spoke of abducting members of the public and beheading them on camera. Earlier this month in Britain, 4 men were arrested because authorities feared they may be planning an attack, also possibly a beheading. ISIS has urged sympathizers to commit random, public, gruesome acts of violence. So how do countries defend against that? The answer, according to Karen Greenberg, director of the Center on National Security at Fordham Law School in New York, is they do it differently. Karen Greenberg, welcome to the program. It's good.
Thank you for having me.
And first, tell us about the pattern here, the idea of urging people to go out and commit an attack in your native land against any non-believer. Is that what we're seeing?
Correct. This isn't a new narrative. It's just a narrative that seems to have caught on via social media, maybe a little faster and is spreading in a little more viral way, but it's certainly not new. It was something that you saw every now and then in Al-Qaeda statements and things like that. To your earlier question about, how do you address this? Mm-hmm. Law enforcement has to decide whether or not to be proactive and preventive, how long they're going to follow a suspect before they arrest, just where that line is. But if the person's not even on their radar and it's really that random an act, that's a whole different wax.
Well, in Canada this week, it seems that the 2 men implicated in the killings of Canadian soldiers were very much on the radar of the Canadians, so much so that their passports had been taken away and they were supposed to be being watched. Was what Canada did about those 2 men very different from what, say, the U.S. or Australia would do about it?
Well, I think what U.S. law enforcement would say was if they had somebody who rose to the level of the counterpart of what Canada did, which was to take away their passports, this is where the FBI says that it comes in and it engages with these individuals. It watches these individuals. It may communicate with community leaders about these individuals. To say that the Canadians were watching these individuals is hard to believe, given what happened. So I think that Canada has not been as proactive as the United States. In some ways, the United States has been accused of being too proactive.
The Australians, when they saw information from ISIS urging this kind of killings, staged mammoth raids. Is that a different approach from what the U.S. would take or Canada took?
This is something a path you probably don't want to go down as a society. You want to think twice before you react with that kind of fear, and you have to understand that to call something terrorism, you used to be talking about something organized, somebody participating in a network, rather than a self-designated individual who is psychologically unstable and may be going down a different path. And so you have to think very hard about whether you want to be mounting this massive arrests or infiltrations the way we've seen, or if you want to begin to look at how to divert this at earlier stages and in different ways.
You said that the idea of saying that the Canadians were watching the 2 men who were involved in this week's killings of soldiers would be it's implausible. What should they do? Should they have been surveilling these people? Should they have confronted them face to face? Should they have been following them?
You know, I think that it really depends on the facts and the circumstances, which we don't know. I think confronting individuals face to face, if you have evidence, could be one thing. Reaching out to their community could be another thing. One of these young men had been turned away from his mosque a couple of years ago for his unseemly behavior that they were worried about. I think if we take away the social structures that can help law enforcement and help these individuals, we're forcing more and more alienation, which is a cause, in part, of what's happening with these young men.
Thanks for talking with us.
Thanks for having me.
That's Karen Greenberg, who is director of the Center on National Security at Fordham Law School.
In New Orleans, among many musicians, there's a special sound that lets players know it's time to pick up their instruments and strike up the band. Where did this signal come from? As Eve Abrams reports, it might have its roots in nature.
When New Orleans musicians want to say a certain thing, instead of words, they use a 4-note phrase.
It's a bugle call or a band call to assemble.
It's like, come on, rally, come to the bandstand and be ready to do it. Let's go.
It's a secret musician's call. Don't tell anybody I told you that.
Yeah.
We either whistle or we play that on our horn.
Yeah, a call. A call to play.
Those musicians, Leroy Jones, Matt Bell, Craig Klein, Wendell Brunius, and James Singleton, they're talking about a call that doesn't belong to musicians alone. That's another common New Orleans species, the mockingbird.
So I was lying in bed, and I woke up to hear that call. I heard this, and my first thought was somebody's at the door.
Journalist and music lover Katie Rechtal.
And then I realized that no, it wasn't anybody at the door, that it was actually a bird in the tree.
When I hear that 4-note whistle, it sounds like a mockingbird to me, very much. And my name is Peter Yockey. I'm a professor at the University of New Orleans in the Department of Geography, and I also am the campus ornithologist. I study birds.
And that's where Yockey thinks musicians got the phrase.
That particular whistle sounds very much like the phrases a mockingbird would use. It's repetitive, it's got the right pitch, it's got the right amount of substance to the notes, and they acquire more and more phrases during their lifetime by imitating things.
Sitting at his piano, Leroy Jones says this call is more than a perfect bird phrase. It's a perfect musical phrase.
Whatever pitch you start at, the root note, and in the fourth away is the top note that you would whistle or that you would play. In the musical terms, it's a perfect fourth. Because it's the fourth degree of the scale. Like, do, re, mi, fa. It's just a portion of a scale.
So who is imitating whom? Ornithologist Kim Derrickson at Loyola University in Baltimore studies mockingbirds. He says perfect fourths sound good to people, and maybe birds too.
I think that there are certain sounds that kind of propagate through the environment and sound good.
Musicians and mockingbirds often occupy the same environment. They certainly keep the same late-night hours, so it's easy to imagine a player heading home after a gig and hearing those 4 notes whistled in the trees. Or maybe a mockingbird perched outside a club overheard a trumpeter call the band back for one final set. That's how trumpeter Leroy Jones thinks it happened.
They pick up everything they hear. And we have one that comes so early in the morning to put the window down. He was right in the tree. It's not annoying, but I mean, at 6, I don't want to hear you singing, whistling, going through a whole cadence of different whistles, and all of a sudden you... Because he's probably heard that, being, in the neighborhood.
I would certainly think it'd be more likely that the musician learned it from the bird.
Again, Peter Yockey.
Because the fact that the notes sounded so mockingbird-like to me means that either they learned it from a musician, then it's spread throughout the species, which seems pretty unlikely, or it's more likely that the musician heard it from the bird.
But Leroy Jones doesn't buy that. He says these 4 notes call musicians to the streets during second-line parades almost every Sunday of the year.
It pierces through no matter what, if there's big ruckus going on. You know, you got hundreds of multitude of people out at the second line, and you can hear that above all of that. And you can always tell somebody who lives here, or has lived here, or is from here, when they hear that signal, they look. This is something very unique to New Orleans.
Ornithologist Kim Derrickson says regardless of who came up with the call first, it's been passed from musician to musician and bird to bird.
Mockingbirds are like musicians. They will take a sound and play with it, especially early in the spring when they're trying to attract a female.
Just like many a young musician with romance on the mind. For NPR News, I'm Eve Abrams in New Orleans.
Listen to the mockingbird. Listen to the mockingbird. The mockingbird.
This is All Things Considered from NPR News.
The new movie Revenge of the Green Dragons is about violent Asian American gangs in the 80s. The true story was even bloodier than the movie.
You could not notice the bodies that were starting to pop up. Those things really sent a shock through everybody's system.
A criminal empire built on human smuggling. On the next morning edition from NPR News.
Tomorrow morning from 5 to 9 a.m.
At 3:20, 73 degrees in New Orleans. It's a nice afternoon. Cool breezes out of the north at 10 miles per hour. Humidity just 37%. A clear overnight period ahead for us. Lows in the upper 50s. And the winds northeast 5 to 10. They'll stay with us tomorrow for the next couple of days, actually, into the weekend. And tomorrow will be sunny with a high near 75. Saturday could be even warmer. Support for WWNO comes from the Sanger Theater, presenting Ray LaMontagne in concert Monday the 27th with the Bell Brigade. Tickets available now. Info at sangernola.com. Also from the law firm of Booth & Booth. Services provided by attorneys Jane and Vincent Booth include family law, personal injury, wills and estates, corporate representation, and small business advice. Their website is boothandbooth.com.
From NPR News, this is All Things Considered. I'm Audie Cornish.
And I'm Robert Siegel. There are new details on a very dark chapter of the story of one of the most prestigious public universities in the country, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. An independent investigation is out this week about a long-running scandal. For nearly 2 decades, students, many of them athletes, took phony classes and got bogus grades. In a moment, we'll have a conversation with the university's chancellor. First, we'll hear the details from reporter Jeff Tiberi of member station WUNC.
For 18 years, students at UNC took classes that didn't meet. They required nothing more than a paper, which was often plagiarized and generally resulted in a high grade. Chancellor Carol Folt, who took over a year ago, spoke yesterday about the latest investigation.
I am deeply disappointed in the duration and the extent of the wrongdoing, as well as the lack of oversight, specifically vital missing checks and balances.
Those missing checks and balances allowed the chair of the African and Afro-American Studies Department and a staff secretary to create phony one-on-one courses that allowed students to boost their GPAs. About half of those students were athletes who needed the boost so they could keep playing. Yesterday, the lead investigator, Kenneth Weinstein, revealed the findings of an 8-month review. The former federal prosecutor found that more than 3,100 students were involved in the scheme that lasted from 1993 until 2011. He described how that secretary, who's now retired, orchestrated it all.
She'd give them the paper assignment. She would grade that paper herself, do so typically with an A or a B+, and the grading would be done pretty much without regard to the quality of the paper. There was never a faculty member involved in the process.
The report did not implicate any high-ranking administrators or coaches.
It's not shocking to me at all. This is the cost of doing business in big-time college sport.
Richard Southall is director of the College Sport Research Institute at the University of South Carolina.
I think what this is indicative of is the inability of everyone involved in college sport to step back and take a hard, fast look at the system.
There have been other scandals involving no-show fake paper classes at Auburn University and the University of Michigan. This report is the most comprehensive of anything to date.
Oh, it's by far the biggest scandal because Chapel Hill aspires to be an elite university.
Greg Easterbrook is a sports writer and editor at the Atlantic Monthly. He says the report doesn't look high enough up the ladder.
Thousands of students over 18 years and not one single person in University of North Carolina Chapel Hill leadership had any responsibility. Nobody knew anything. Nobody should be blamed or penalized in any way at the top. It's a whitewash through and through.
Still, the school did announce 4 staff members have been fired because of information from the investigation. Another 5 are under disciplinary review. UNC did not indicate if it will review diplomas from any of the thousands of students who took the phony classes. For NPR News, I'm Jeff Tiberi in North Carolina.
Now a conversation with UNC's Chancellor Carol Holt. I began by asking her about the accusation you just heard, that this report is a whitewash.
The Weinstein report would hardly be considered a whitewash since it was the actual report that identified for the first time that 18-year history and has actually given us the grounds to take actions that haven't already been put in place to make sure it would never happen again. One of the things that was pointed out was a really shocking lack of check and balances.
We want to talk about some of these missed red flags. One example from the report, an email in which a faculty member named Jan Boxell, she actually served as an academic counselor for the women's basketball team and has run a center for ethics actually at the University of all things. In this email, she says she didn't look at a student's paper, that a D grade will be fine, and that she figured it was a recycled paper, as in plagiarized, and she seemed completely untroubled by that. Does Professor Boxell still have her job?
Well, I think I've said from the start that we're not going to discuss personnel actions, and so I really won't talk about that with you either. I will say that that type of behavior is not something that I find even remotely acceptable.
This does get at the issue of academic counseling. The academic support program for student athletes is cited all over this report as funneling students towards these phantom and fake classes. At this point, what are you doing with that program? Does it get overhauled altogether? Was it completely corrupted?
So I think what's really important to realize is that that report is talking about things that first became known by people here beginning in 2011. There had been years of work going on at Chapel Hill. I wasn't here. I came in recently and was asked really to lead the institution and to get to the bottom of this if that whenever new information became possible. But in that period of time, the university had put in more than 70 new processes, including everything that you can imagine to make sure that these sorts of omissions in review, as I said, the checks and balances that are necessary, those are all in place.
Can you give us an example?
Oh, an example would be, first of all, there's a review of every chair of every department, an annual review. There is now a very strong electronic record system that follows students that are in independent study classes. We flag for further review all classes that have student-athlete enrollments of more than 20% of the class. You know, I could go on. There are many in place, and so I'm very pleased with that. The first thing we did when we saw the report is sit down and go, okay, once again, let's go through it in great detail. I want to be confident that everything that shows up in this report, we believe right now we have all the mechanisms in place that would find that and stop it and bring to our attention anyone who was involved in it.
Do you see what happened at UNC as emblematic of something going on in high-stakes Division I, college sports, revenue-generating sports?
I'm really focused on what's happening here. And I think that...
But you understand why I can ask. I mean, the Carolina Way, right, was a brand, which meant winning on the court or on the field, as well as winning in the classroom. This certainly undermines that.
Well, what I'm saying is that I have to focus on what we can do here rather than try to determine whether other people are doing it at their institutions. And I believe very strongly that that is our aspiration, is to have them be successful on the field and in the classroom. And I think we're going to put the things in place that are necessary to make our people feel confident about what we're doing. I want our students to feel that when they enter this wonderful university, they're going to have a great academic experience, and we're going to help them thrive. And so I'm willing to do what it takes to make sure that we're confident in that.
Carol Folt, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you.
Carol Folt is the Chancellor of UNC Chapel Hill.
This is NPR News.
Support for NPR comes from NPR member stations and from CFP on behalf of certified financial planner professionals committed to the highest standard in personal financial advice at letsmakeaplan.org. From Subaru, featuring the all-new Subaru Outback. Love, it's what makes a Subaru a Subaru. Learn more at Subaru.com. And from The Honest Company, providing natural, eco-friendly products for the family and home. Learn more at Honest.com. This is NPR.
On the next On Being.
I think never in human history has so few people with so few actual needs caused such fear in so many. And it's blinding us to the possibilities of political change, which really could bring the world forward in an interesting way.
Scott Atran studies why some young people turn to terrorism and others turn away. I'm Krista Tippett. Please join us.
Sunday morning at 10 on WWNO.
That is a very good program. I hope you tune in from time to time. Support for all of our programs at WWNO comes from Goat in the Road Productions, presenting Numb, a theatrical performance in association with the New Orleans Pharmacy Museum about the history of anesthesiology and the complicated human stories that accompany advancement. November 7th through December 6th. Ticket information available at goatintheroadproductions.org. Support also comes from Interface Consulting International, consulting experts for legal and construction communities on problem projects and disputes since 1986. They built their reputation by getting into trouble. Online at interface-consulting.com or 800-626-0054. Cell phone problems with 911 coming up later on this hour on All Things Considered.
From NPR News in Washington, I'm Craig Wyndham. There's a heavy police presence in and around Canada's Parliament building today following yesterday's incident in which a Canadian soldier was killed by a gunman who was then shot to death himself as he entered the building. Royal Canadian Mounted Police Commissioner Bob Paulson says police have confirmed that the gunman was 32-year-old Michael Zihaf-Bibo.
He was in town to deal with a passport issue, but that he was also hoping to leave for Syria.
Authorities say Zihaf-Bibo was a recent convert to Islam. White House Press Secretary Josh Earnest says the U.S. has been working with Canada on ways to keep young people from being lured by extremist groups such as the so-called Islamic State.
To make sure that the messages recruiting vulnerable youth to engage in violent extremism are properly countered.
School officials say 3 teenage girls from suburban Denver who were intercepted last weekend as they reportedly tried to travel to Syria to join the so-called Islamic State had no prior disciplinary problems. Colorado Public Radio's Megan Perlee reports it was the latest case of young Muslim women from Western nations trying to join militant groups.
School officials say they first learned of the girls' disappearance when concerned students showed them tweets from the girls asking asking for people's prayers, and other tweets suggesting the teens had run away. Dustin Amel, spokeswoman for the Cherry Creek School District, says it appears the girls were recruited over the internet.
All the information that we have right now indicates that these girls were likely victims of online predators. Online predators are not new. This is just a new twist for us.
The 3 girls have been returned to their families in Colorado. It's unclear if they'll face any charges. For NPR News, I'm Megan Verlee in Denver.
Stocks posted solid gains on Wall Street today. The Dow Jones Industrial Average closed up 216 points at 16,677. The Nasdaq Composite was up 69. This is NPR.
Support for NPR comes from Quantcast, providing digital advertising technology that uses big data for marketers to reach new customers on the web. Learn more at quantcast.com.
You can see the Great Barrier Reef from outer space.
The region it encompasses is bigger than Japan. I gather it's even half the size of Texas.
Find out what's threatening the reef and how life's about to change for the people living on remote islands in the Pacific.
They live really as their elders did thousands of years ago. And they'll invite you into the village and show you how they do things.
Explore the South Seas with us on Travel with Rick Steves.
Saturday at 6 a.m. here on 89.9 WWNO. Going beyond Europe with Mr. Steves. He was a recent guest on another of our weekend programs. Wait, don't tell me. Funny, too. 3:33 is your time.
When we look at waves in the stadium, we look at traffic jams on the highway, those are really interesting to us, even though we study neuroscience, because they potentially tell us how simple units can interact to produce very complex things.
Welcome to Pulse of the Planet Science Diaries, a glimpse of the world of science from the inside. We're with John Beggs, a biophysicist at Indiana University, who studies the human brain.
I wanted to spend a couple minutes just talking about emergent properties. What do I mean by that? Well, most things have properties that are pretty easy to see. So if you pick up a rock, for example, it has a certain amount of mass, it has a temperature, it has a volume. But when you get large groups of things that are interacting, sometimes properties emerge that aren't there when you just look at an individual from the group. Say, for example, we've got a big stadium. And in a big stadium, we've got lots and lots of people, and they can get together and form the wave that slowly travels around the stadium. Now, the wave is not something that you could ever understand by just studying one person by themselves. You know, you can see a person stand up and then sit down, and maybe stand up and even, throw their hands and go, whoa. But you'd never know anything about how fast the wave would travel, how broad it would be. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think this is very important in the way we study how the brain processes information. The brain is made up of billions and billions of little neurons, and each one of these neurons, or brain cells, is probably not doing anything too amazing by itself.